afternoon. Welcome to the Nashville Public Library. I'm Susan Earle, the main library administrator. I knew you'd all get quiet. If you'll do us a favor and a favor to your neighbor and the speaker, please make sure that your cell phones are either completely turned off or put on vibrator or whatever. I shouldn't say that word. But, but anyway, nobody choke. At any rate, I want to also invite you to go across the hall. We still have our Voices and Visions exhibit that has a great panoramic view of our civil rights movement in Nashville. And also we have books set aside that if you wanted to have further reading on the topic that will be talked about today, then you can check them out right here, right now, without having to go stand in line or anything like that. Also, do check out our website. We have Spring into the Arts going on right now in all our community locations as well as Maine. And we do want you to come to those programs. They're really quite fun. Now, enough about the library. I would like to introduce Christine Bradley. She's the Assistant Vice Chancellor for Community, Neighborhood, and Government Relations. And we can't do this program without Vanderbilt University, so please welcome her.
I promise I'll just take a second, but welcome, welcome. This is a fabulous crowd, and this is going to be a great event today, and I'll not take too long so we can get right to the speaker. I wanted to thank David Wood for getting our speaker today, for all his support throughout all of these events. I kind of have to admit, though, that I did wonder today. Mary Pat usually is up here sort of, you know, introducing and saying hello and that kind of thing, and I looked at the topic, and it said the public and its emotional problems, and I thought, I wonder why they picked me to come up here and do this. But without further ado, David Wood, I'll go ahead and let you introduce the speaker. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Susan, and thank you, Christine, and thank you for turning up again. Our speaker today is very special. Thinking out of the box, out of the lunchbox, is a forum for public discussion and reflection. Lynn Clarke writes and teaches and thinks about communication, about rhetoric, and about the affective, often traumatic background against which public deliberation takes place. So she's, in a sense, talking about the very kind of thing that we're trying to do. As we've heard from speakers in previous years, our democracy is not something we can just take for granted. It needs nourishing and cultivating and protecting against forces that distort and undermine it. It requires informed citizens who can see through and resist demagoguery and exercise their vote in responsible ways. In the old days, people who taught rhetoric were expected to convey the skills of persuasion, irrespective of the true merits of the case. This was the gripe that Socrates had with the sophists. Nowadays, rhetoric has much more to do with learning how to resist irrational appeals and freeing ourselves from their grip. Professor Clarke is an assistant professor in Vanderbilt's Communication Studies Department. She has a PhD from Northwestern in Communication Studies. She teaches public speaking and public argument at Vanderbilt. And she looks at the rhetoric of social movements. Her research focuses on how our self-understanding, our identity, affects our grasp of the collective interest and how it can change over time. More broadly, she looks at the role of rhetoric in public life. She writes about hot-button issues like gay marriage and other American sex controversies. And she's working on a book, Rhetorical Interventions, Recovering Deliberative Politics from Traumatic Social Controversy. Our talk today, echoing a phrase of John Dewey's, is provocatively entitled The Public and Its Emotional Problems. Please welcome Lynn Clarke.
Thank you, David, for that generous introduction. I'd like to thank the Nashville Public Library for supporting the series, and of course I'd like to thank Vanderbilt for its role in the series as well. As you can probably tell from my voice, I am actually recovering from a little cold that I caught recently. So please bear with me. I may cough a little bit and clear my throat a little bit, but I'm going to try to get through this as best I can, and I look forward to your questions at the end. As David mentioned, I spent a lot of time thinking and reading about and researching the public, and I've never actually had an opportunity to speak to the public. So I'm not quite sure what's going to happen next, but I do think that this is going to be an opportunity for me to learn a few things, and I certainly hope that it'll be an opportunity for you to learn a few things as well. In other words, I hope something good comes out of this for the both of us. 80 years ago, American philosopher John Dewey announced that the public had some problems. According to Dewey, these problems were getting in the way of the public's ability to define its interests and see to it that these interests were being served by the state. Today, I will argue that the public has an emotional problem that Dewey did not identify, but that is worthy of our attention nevertheless. In my presentation, I will recollect the public's problems as Dewey saw them in 1927, and these problems remain with us today, as I'm sure you all will eventually agree. I will then define the emotional problem that I believe the public faces and offer some evidence of its presence in our society. And finally, I will briefly outline Dewey's solution to the problems he identified, and then propose an additional component to specifically address the emotional problem. I begin with a discussion of what Dewey meant by the public and its relationship to the democratic state. This discussion may turn out to be more of a civics lesson than many of you need, but I want to make sure that we're all on the same page, so bear with me if you would. At a minimum, the public is distinguished from the private. But as one might expect, Dewey had something much more specific in mind. He offers the following definition, quote, "The public consists of all those who are affected by the indirect consequences of transactions, to such an extent that it is deemed necessary to have those consequences systematically cared for." Now, there's several ideas that are important in this definition. First, the public is neither a static nor permanent entity. It only comes into being in response to a contingency arising from human transactions. Second, the public has an occasion to emerge when the consequences of a transaction seriously affect individuals other than those who were party to the transaction. Third, the public cannot form if individuals do not perceive the indirect consequences of a particular transaction. When individuals become aware of the effects of others' activity, they can group together, constitute themselves as a public, and try to address the consequences in some way. Fourth, the aim of the public is to regulate transactions. Depending on whether the consequences are desirable, the regulation may serve to encourage or restrict the transactions that cause them. But regardless of how much or how little the consequences are desired, regulation is the public's chief aim. Now that we know what Dewey means by the public, we can ask, what is the relationship between the public and the democratic state? The answer lies in the public's desire to influence the consequences it perceives. Writes Dewey, quote, "The public is organized and made effective by means of representatives who, as guardians of custom, as legislators, as executives, judges, etc., care for its especial interests by methods intended to regulate the transactions of individuals and groups." Unquote. When representatives serve the public's interests through the mechanisms of the state, the public becomes a political organization and something like government comes into being. In other words, between the public and the state sits the government. Of course, the public can't expect to see its interests served by the state if government officials are not held accountable to them. Not surprisingly, holding officials accountable is the task of citizens in the democratic state. task has two aspects, one directed towards elected officials, the other towards citizens themselves. Regarding the first group, Dewey observes that only through constant watchfulness and criticism of public officials by citizens can a state be maintained in integrity and usefulness. Elected representatives have private interests, as we all know, and citizens must watch out for their influence on public policy. If critical vigilance proves inadequate, citizens have recourse to the vote, the formal mechanism by which accountability may be enforced. Now, Dewey points out that voting is premised upon the idea that each citizen voter is entrusted with the public interest and is thereby expected to vote in the public's name. In Dewey's terms, each citizen voter is an officer of the public. But we know that citizens themselves have private interests, and that these interests sometimes override their commitment to serve the public. When it comes to representation, in other words, non-elected officers, like their elected counterparts, have a dual capacity, that is, a capacity to represent public interests and a capacity to represent private interests. Citizens must therefore hold each other accountable, something that can only happen through public debate. In short, serving the public's interests assumes an organized public, a democratic state, and a government of, by, and for the people. So far, I have discussed Dewey's definition of the public and the relationships between this entity, the government, and the democratic state. I would now like to offer what Dewey saw as the public's problems. Though he wrote in 1927, these problems are alive and with us today. Dewey focused his analysis on the American case, and the first problem he identified has to do with the public's ability to act on its interests and be taken seriously by those who claim to represent them. As we just discussed, this ability assumes the presence of an organized public. Unfortunately, however, Dewey concluded that the American public was far from organized. Wrote Dewey, quote, "The public seems to be lost. It is certainly bewildered." He continued, "If a public exists, it is surely as uncertain about its whereabouts as philosophers since Hume have been about the residence and makeup of the South." To support this provocative claim, Dewey offered as evidence several signs or symptoms of a lost or eclipsed public. These symptoms were familiar to most citizens at the time. They were commonplaces of the political scene. Perhaps the most well-known symptom is the decreasing proportion of eligible voters making use of the franchise. A second symptom is the deeply entrenched institution of two-party politics. According to Dewey, it is difficult for an individual to become a candidate for office without the muscle of the Republican or Democratic machineries. Indeed, Dewey writes, popular imagination can conceive of no other way by which officials may be selected and governmental affairs carried on. Even a third party can lead only a spasmodic and precarious existence. I noticed there was a book by Ralph Nader on the exhibit desk outside. I'm certainly pleased to see that. Maybe there's hope for a third party after all. Dewey also observed that citizens' votes are often dictated by their attitudes towards the governing party. To him, this is the third symptom of the public's eclipse. As a rule, he wrote, what decides the fate of a person who comes up for election is neither his political excellence nor his political defects. The current runs for or against the party in power, and the individual candidate sinks or swims as runs the current. And if the current's forces do not prevail, Dewey claims, habit, party funds, the skill of managers of the machine, the portrait of a candidate with his firm jaw, his lovely wife and children, and a multitude of other irrelevancies determine the issue. What accounts for these symptoms of the public's eclipse, of its inability to identify and find itself? According to Dewey, technological developments have created conditions that are inhospitable to the public. With the vastly improved technology of the industrial age, the number and complexity of indirect consequences increased substantially. In turn, this increase made it difficult for ordinary individuals to account for the consequences they experience. At present, Dewey writes, many consequences are felt rather than perceived. They are suffered, but they cannot be said to be known, for they are not, by those who experience them, referred to their origins. Moreover, when individuals do manage to account for the consequences, they have trouble forming and sustaining a coherent, organized public that can work to regulate the transactions that cause them. And why is this? As Dewey explains it, the reasons are several. First, the ramification of the issues before the public is so wide and intricate, the technical matters involved are so specialized, and the details are so many and so shifting, that the public cannot for any length of time identify and hold itself. Second, this diffused and scattered public often appears in the form of numerous smaller publics competing for the attention of government officers in ways that undermine their potential influence. Third, in competing for attention, the multiple publics fail to work together to generate the force of organized numbers. Quote, there are too many publics with little to hold these different publics together in an integrated whole. Thus, the public is diffuse, disorganized, and internally competitive, and therefore unable to fulfill its democratic governing function. Dewey also believed that the public's problems are exacerbated by other less immediate factors. Among them are the increase in the number, variety, and cheapness of amusements, which divert attention from the work of identifying consequences that are already hard to perceive, the increasing mobility of individuals, which undermines attachment to civic associations, the tendency of news reporters to disseminate bits of information without providing the context necessary for grasping their public significance, or lack thereof, and finally, the presence of demagogues who take advantage of the vulnerable populace and further undermine citizens' ability to define the public interests. So we now have an understanding of the public and its problems as Dewey defined them. Not incidentally, these troubles are very much with us today. Nevertheless, I want to turn our attention to a problem that Dewey did not mention, but that is worthy of consideration. And this problem is emotional. What do I mean by the public's emotional problem? Simply put, it is the difficulty that citizens have perceiving and reflecting upon any uncomfortable feelings they experience when dealing with controversial issues. This emotional problem exists because we rarely consider the feelings we experience as useful public information. We rarely ask whether we know what we are feeling in respect of controversial issues, and whether we understand the subjective significance of the feelings, that is, whether we know what the feelings mean about ourselves and about our relationships to the issues and the people that arouse them. Most of the time, we focus on what's going on outside of us and ignore what's going on inside, as if there's nothing valuable to be learned from our inner experiences. In short, where Dewey sees a public having trouble perceiving the external consequences of transactions, I see a public having an additional and equally unsettling problem, namely a difficulty perceiving and publicly reflecting on the internal consequences of others' transactions. To give one example of the public's emotional problem, let me turn to the issue of immigration as it has been emerging in Davidson County. Several facts about the transaction of immigration must be noted. Based on data gathered by the U.S. Census Bureau, the number of foreign-born Middle Tennessee residents has more than quadrupled since the early 1990s. The Nashville area's immigrant population has grown from fewer than 18,000 people in 1990 to an estimated 84,000 today. In addition, the overwhelming majority of newcomers have been Hispanic. Finally, the Nashville area is presently 80% white and overwhelmingly English-speaking. What are the indirect external consequences of the recent wave of immigration to Tennessee? Several have been identified, including employment and labor force growth, low labor costs, relatively cheaper products and services, an increased need for workforce investment services, like on-the-job training, an increased use of social services by those immigrants who need them, an increase in the number of non-English speakers residing in the state, and an unprecedented change in the racial and ethnic demographics of Tennessee. These are only some of the external indirect consequences, and they are likely to have consequences of their own. But what about the indirect internal consequences? To answer this question, we need to attend to what citizens are publicly saying about their feelings. But examples of this kind of self-disclosure, as I mentioned before, are few and far between. So we will also have to consider attributions made by others. At best, these attributions are hypotheses that can only be validated by the persons to whom they are attributed. Nevertheless, absent self-disclosure, they provide something of an indication of what individuals may be feeling. Finally, I will draw and offer a few inferences about feelings from citizen speech as reported in the news. The talk around the English First Bill that was introduced to Metro Council last September and vetoed by Mayor Bill Purcell last month provides a recent and convenient case study. Just to remind you, the bill sought to reaffirm English as the official language of the metropolitan government and require the majority of Metro's communications, publications, and telephone answering systems to be in English. Beginning with self-reports, of which I only found one in the Tennessean. A 40-year-old man living in Hermitage was reported to have said that, quote, the new wave of immigration has made him feel unwelcome in his own community. He also expressed a sense of feeling threatened. Quote, this is my country. I have fought for this country. I am not going to let illegal immigrants come in and intimidate us. Turning now to internal consequences that some individuals have attributed to others, one woman who was born in Sri Lanka, has lived in Nashville since 1994, and learned English as a child, attributed feelings of insecurity to people who see her and automatically assume she cannot speak English. I felt the look, she said, but really, when I start talking, people act different. When you have a group that is visibly coming in droves, she continued, and you hear them speaking another language, people find that threatening. It's very psychological. Other individuals have attributed feelings of anxiety to many native Southerners. According to Farrell Guillory, who directs the program on public life in the Center for the Study of the American South at the University of North Carolina, Southerners have experienced several dizzying changes in the past half-decade, including urbanization, desegregation, the loss of manufacturing, and the move towards less physical jobs. Guillory believes that these changes have induced an anxiety that is intensified by the recent influx of Spanish-speaking immigrants, an influx that constitutes yet another significant social change. Finally, allow me to draw a couple inferences from what two individuals have said about immigrants in Tennessee when the council was considering the English First Bill. In a short piece on readers who linked illegal immigration to unrelated ills, the Tennessean reported that one person, commenting on a story about the state's population reaching 6 million, wrote the following, quote, notice how the girl that wrote this piece referred to the 50,000 new residents as move-ins, clearly avoiding the more truthful yet politically incorrect term, illegal aliens who swarm here like disease-carrying flies. Again, I cannot say with certainty what this particular commentator is feeling, but what I can say is that these words suggest a person who feels strong aversion or disgust towards unlawful or undocumented immigrants, most of whom are Latino. Here's another comment that suggests strong feelings of aversion on the part of its author. In an email sent to Stephen Fotopoulos, of Tennessee Immigrant and Refugee Rights Coalition. The sender wrote, quote, "You are a lying, deceitful, rotten traitor, and an enemy to every American for betraying your country. If you like illegal aliens so much, why don't you go south of the border, live there, and stay there? And take all the other turd lovers and criminal illegal alien law-breaking filth with you. You belong with the other inferior substandard scum. You're not good enough to be an American." Taken all together, the quotations I have just offered suggest that apart from the consequences that Dewey discussed, transactions may have internal indirect consequences as well. If it is reasonable to claim that these internal consequences undermine individuals' ability to perceive external consequences and the transactions that caused them, and I believe it is, then we have reason to argue that the public's emotional problem may thwart its capacity to govern. The public may be psychologically unprepared to take account of the objectively available consequences or facts that citizens must know if they are to form integrated, organized, and coherent publics and appropriately regulate transactions. I'd like to end with a brief discussion of possible solutions to the public's problems, as I have outlined them here today. Once again, let's start with Dewey. Addressing the question of solutions, Dewey wrote that there can be no public without publicity in respect to all consequences which concern it. Focused again on external consequences, Dewey's answer to the problem of publicity was freedom of social inquiry and of distribution of its conclusions. Through social scientific inquiry, transactions and their contexts and consequences can be named, and through public dissemination, the names and the meanings they carry can be widely obtained or tested. Importantly, the idea of testing the results of inquiry concedes that social scientists can and do disagree. Dewey also observed that even when there is agreement on consequences and meanings, there may still be dispute over the best policy to try out. In other words, along with inquiry and distribution of results, Dewey believed that debate was vital to the functioning of the democratic state. Excuse me. Finally, Dewey knew that scholarly presentations can be dreary, and that the conventionalized and routine consciousness of human beings often becomes an obstacle to learning. In light of this problem, Dewey argued that the results of social inquiry must be presented to the public through a subtle, delicate, vivid, and responsive art of communication. In short, to recover the public from eclipse, Dewey called for, quote, improvement of the methods and conditions of debate, discussion, and persuasion. But if the emotional problems I have identified do actually exist, and if they are to be taken seriously, we may need to add another speech practice to the mix. I am thinking here of consciousness raising, which has historically been associated with the struggle for women's liberation. Webster's New World Dictionary defines consciousness raising as the process of seeking, especially through group sessions, to increase awareness of one's role, attitudes, needs, etc., in connection with the personal, social, sexual, etc. problems of modern life. In the search for self-awareness, individuals disclose their personal experiences in order to learn whether those experiences are shared by others in the group. As well, individuals turn a critical lens on themselves, turning their attitudes, needs, feelings, motives, and desires into objects of inquiry for their own self-reflection. Because individual subjective experiences are always informed by social norms and cultural values and ideals, consciousness raising invites participants to link their experiences to the larger social and cultural contexts in which they occur. The overall aim of the process is to gain insight into oneself and to understand the promises and limits of the culture in which one lives. This insight and understanding become the basis for future discussion and action. As I mentioned moments ago, consciousness raising is most often identified with the women's liberation movement, where it served a particular function. But this unique political history may have prevented us from seeing the potential value that consciousness raising may have for all members of society. Perhaps all of us, including persons who are of the mindset that immigrants are inferior scum, may benefit from knowing what those persons are feeling in regard of Latinos and immigration, and what the feelings mean in their lives. From there, we might have a better chance of consciously deciding whether the feelings should take the place of evidence in a policy debate. Similarly, perhaps all of us, including those persons who are anxious about the external consequences of immigration and feel threatened by the influx of non-English speakers, may benefit from knowing what these persons are feeling and understanding the significance of those feelings in their lives. We may then know better what to say and do in light of them. And so I end with a question. If the public has an emotional problem, might it be worth our whiles to find out whether consciousness raising or something like it can help the public find itself again?
Thank you so much. We're going to start off with a little discussion up here, and then we'll open the discussion to the floor. I remember once when I'm one of these immigrants who came to the Nashville community, so I really feel at home in what you're talking about here. And I remember coming over trying to figure out who the Ku Klux Klan were, because I'd heard about them. I didn't know who they were. And I remember Googling them and finding that there was this Ku Klux Klan poetry. And I thought, well, that's interesting. They're poets. It didn't last long. I understood a bit more eventually. But what really fascinated me was that these white guys actually had emotions, and they were deeply held and deeply felt, and so on. And I guess I'm wondering if you could say maybe just a little bit more about how you think this public, this bigger public, can both acknowledge these regressive emotions without legitimating them. I mean, how we can take them seriously without taking them too seriously. And how, I mean, emotions, especially those that have some background or basis in trauma or in dramatic, social change, are pretty hard to simply eradicate. I mean, there are probably, if you try and ask yourself why these people in Pulaski, for example, thought the way they did, I mean, the explanations are not just psychological. They are to do with class and poverty and all kinds of things. So I guess I've become aware, and especially if you think about some of the issues to do with the war and patriotism and bringing our troops back or keeping them there, and the extraordinary emotions raised by these issues, some of which look very regressive and some of which seem quite legitimate. How do we negotiate our way through this emotional morass?
Yeah, David, that's a great question. For a number of reasons, and it's a bit of a puzzle for me, because on the one hand, if the emotions exist, and if we think back to someone like Aristotle, who believed that emotions are signs of something, signs of beliefs, signs of opinions, and that those opinions may be appropriate or inappropriate, and correctable if they are inappropriate, then it would seem that naming those emotions would be a good thing to do. If we know what people are feeling, then we can ask the question, why are they feeling it? And presumably we can fill them with the necessary information to make sure that they're feeling the appropriate emotions at the right time, in the right place, towards the right things, and so forth. On the other hand, when we think of the extreme examples, and I think the last two that I pulled out from the Tennessean, along with the KKK, are indicative of this extremity. When we think of these extreme examples, it's hard to imagine a public taking emotion seriously and not sort of devolving into a kind of chaos. And I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure if the risk is avoidable. It may be that we have to decide whether the risk is worth taking or not. And that would, I think, in part turn on how we would go about addressing the question of what people are feeling and why. It seems to me if we just ignore the emotions, if we just ignore the KKK and hope they would go away and assume they're just in the fringes of society and so forth, then we risk them making contact with vulnerable people like ourselves. And I think ultimately we're all vulnerable to messages that are coming from people who we consider to be authorities. If we ignore those folks, then chances are they could take on a bigger life than we would like them to have. So I'm not sure that we want to ignore them.
Have you followed these Truth and Reconciliation commissions? I learned something about the one that's been operating in South Africa, and that struck me as just fascinating, because this involved, if I got this right, people who have had their children murdered and their parents maimed, coming face to face with people who've done this, and actually expressing these emotions and getting it out of their system, and actually confronting each other, and with the sense that through this process something good could happen. Is this the sort of thing that you're talking about when you talked about consciousness raising?
Yeah, I think the TRC it would be one example of what this sort of consciousness raising could look like. And the TRC has had its problems, and one of the nice things about it is that it opened itself up to criticism, and I think that would always be important, especially when we're talking about something like the public. But yeah, and what's interesting about the TRC is that the people of South Africa agreed, generally speaking, that this is something that they wanted to do. It wasn't imposed upon them from above. It was the belief of South Africans that if they were to move forward, they had to have an understanding of what happened in the past, and that required making it possible for people to speak out and talk about what happened in the past and confront what happened in the past, and that would essentially be a painful experience for most of the people involved. So if we believe that was something that was important to us as a civil society, then we could certainly undergo some kind of process like the TRC did. But I would expect it would be grounded in Boer culture as opposed to South African culture, which I would think would be significantly different, even though not entirely.
Yeah. Well, one last question. I was interested that it strikes me both you and Dewey assume that one of the major problems is getting a sort of integrated public that can then exercise some power of vigilance over government, for example. And it strikes me that's increasingly hard in a media-driven world, or at least that the integration may not be in the direction that we would like, because what we call public discussion happens incredibly rarely. I mean, how often do we go down to the marketplace? I mean, this library is the closest thing I've ever seen to a marketplace for public discussion. It's not a bad thing, but I'm just wondering why the public might be thought to be one thing, or would need to be integrated, rather than there might be, as you'd expect there to be in a democracy, many genuine interests, and hence
Dewey correctly, he wasn't troubled by the idea of more than one public. Indeed, the assumption that transactions would have more than one set of consequences and that there would be multiple transactions in any society, one would expect different groups of people to be affected by consequences, and if they perceive them, to somehow try to manage or regulate them. I think Dewey's concern was that there were many publics, but that they lacked the ability to communicate with each other. And this becomes important in the context of something like the public interest. If the state is to regulate transactions in the name of the public, then it seems to me, and I think this is what Dewey also believed, there needs to be some moment at which one can say this such and such constitutes the public interest. It is the public interest to regulate immigration in a certain way. It is a public interest to withdraw troops from Iraq or leave troops in Iraq for X period of month, and so forth. So even though there can be multiple publics, each trying to represent their interests in the government, there needs at some point to be a moment in which we can all agree that the state ought to act in a certain way in the name of something called the public interest.
Thank you very much. Well, what we're going to do now is to ask Professor Clarke just to take out her pen and then write down a bunch of questions. So we're going to take questions from the floor. Gentlemen over here.
Are the basic differences between the fundamental belief systems of liberals and conservatives emotional in nature? If so, what are those emotions?
Okay. Just in front of, okay, there's a question down there? Yes. Okay, the lady down there, and then this gentleman in blue.
First of all, I thought your talk was incredibly provocative at this point in time, facing the next election and how we're going to be inundated on the television set with all kinds of political ads. Anyhow, a couple of things. First of all, I'd like your thoughts on the issue of affect or feelings. And in fact, feelings in and of themselves are not negative or positive. It's acting on the feelings. It's the behavior that may come from a feeling that can either be destructive or productive or helpful or whatever. But the feelings in and of themselves are not good or bad. Then I'm also thought about just yesterday at yahoo.com, there was some little question in one of the little blurbs about why does my husband ignore me? And then there you go and trace down, somebody has looked up an answer to this question and cited two pieces of research. One of them that basically said that in one study, and of course it's just one study, but that the parts, when a woman's voice speaks, two sections of the female brain light up, whereas only one section of the male brain lights up. And that in fact, oftentimes the voice of a female is thought to be more complex and difficult for men to kind of connect to, I guess. And then you go to Deborah Tannen, who wrote the book You Just Don't Understand, Men and Women in Conversation, who also describes women who relate to people in the world in a web form of a fashion. They have, they kind of spread out from the center and have many, many connections in their life, whereas men, as a general rule, tend to relate in a hierarchical fashion. And so I'm wondering, in terms of all the things that you spoke about, which I think are incredibly interesting, but I'm not sure that we fully understand the way in which feelings or affect even dictate our behavior and our thoughts about political issues or, you know, public issues.
Thank you very much. Gentleman down here.
I
appreciate that viewpoint that we need a lot of different kinds of publics. The more publics we bring, the more of a flourishing society we have. But since the days of, I think it was you were talking about, Saul Alinsky came along with the idea, each of the self-interest groups, as we now call them, they have good reasons for which they're pursuing. Big business or little business, all business in Tennessee wants labor, and we all want small prices. At the same time, we want, a good, coherent immigration policy. There's a lot of different competing publics. We just, as you said, don't have forums except the ballot box of representative government in which to sometimes express ourselves because you know how television and newspapers work. I just wondered if you could think of some of what Saul Alinsky used was he was community, he'd bring together the poor, the people, the rich, the businesses, the real estate people, and they'd all give their self-interest aspirations. Then they were able to actually beat each other. And I'm sure if we could beat some Ku Klux Klanners or Hispanics, whatever, we could come to some kind of a better situation than what we got now. If we could think of any more of those platforms or forums.
Thank you. There's just a lady here, and then the gentleman over there.
I want to know if you think we are driven more or manipulated more by our feelings than by our intellect.
And you do that in one sentence. Okay, then. Let me. There's a gentleman up here, and then lady over there. Yep.
Since Dewey, we've had people who have developed skills in the way information is conveyed to groups. Mr. Rowe is a good example of an expert in that, and it's been reported numerous times in the news. Certainly there are many others who do, and of course George Lakoff has written some good books on it. I'm wondering, from the standpoint of sociology, how in the world you manage to get free, unfocused feelings out so that you can come to a consensus in the public without having somebody attempting to steer where it's going to go.
Right.
Hi, my question is, do you think that public...
Okay, just slow down.
Sorry.
Okay.
Okay. My question is, do you think that public discourse is affected by the built environment? Meaning that, do you think that communities and cities that are more sort of Jane Jacobs friendly, that have more humans interacting, walking by each other, not as dependent on the car, promote more public discourse than those that are car dependent, where people live in their own separate communities?
Yeah. Any more questions, or should we? Yes, there's a lady in the pink.
We have with us Wilma, and I'm she. And this is a fabricated monologue. You see that guy walking down the aisle there with bushy hair, kind of short, not too tall? At least he's not 6 feet tall. Well, I heard that woman over there in the red suit say, he's not got blonde hair and blue eyes, let's don't let him in here. And he doesn't speak English. And I heard that old man over there say, well, he speaks Aramaic, and his name's Jesus Christ, so let's let him stay.
Thank you. Would you like to try some of these questions, Lynn?
Question was, are the fundamental beliefs of liberals and conservatives emotional in nature? I suppose no different. The beliefs of liberals and conservatives, the emotional component of those beliefs is not much different from the emotional component of any beliefs, generally speaking. And I say that because I think that when it comes down to it, there may be some sort of basic concerns that we have as human beings, and we seek to have those concerns addressed in some way. And depending on who gets to us first, or how much opportunity we have to gain information through public channels, we might settle on one set of beliefs and not another. So, for example, the basic desire to feel secure, right? I think that's something that we all share. And what we believe will make us insecure might then have some implication for what we decide to do, or which political party we decide to support, or whether we call ourselves liberals, conservatives, progressives, independents, or some other. I can say that liberals seem to be, and frankly, I'm not all that sure what liberal and conservative means these days. I have to be honest about that. There was some work done in the 80s that argued that conservatives tend to be oriented to the past, that they presume that what is good lies in the past, and that liberals presume that change is where goodness lies. If that's true, then one can see a similarity there in that both folks or both groups are interested in something that's good. And again, I think that gets back to the basic needs that we have as human beings, whether it's to feel secure, to feel wanted, to feel like we're a part of our environment, to feel like we have some control over our environment, and that sort of thing. That's the best I can do with that question. I hope that helps in some way. The question about whether feelings are in themselves good or bad, or whether it's the actions that follow from the feelings that we ought to be concerned about. Yeah, I think that's an appropriate way to look at feelings. The one concern that I have is that if feelings are a product of if feelings are a product of a definition of reality that is not complete, or not sufficiently complete. In other words, if I am angry at someone because I believe they stole my candy, and it turns out that they didn't steal my candy, then I ought not be angry at that person, right? And so in that situation, I wouldn't say that the feelings are good or bad, but I would say that they're inappropriate based on the fact that the information, the reality, is that this person didn't steal my candy. That's a relatively classical idea of emotions, which I think we ought to keep in mind. People do get angry for reasons that turn out to be bad, right? They need better evidence, for example, to help them better understand their situation. But apart from that, I agree with you that feelings in themselves are things that they're what we have in response to what we believe is the case, and it's important to ask, what should we do in light of those feelings? Sometimes we should ask for more information. Sometimes we should ask whether we're being too insensitive or sensitive or something of that sort. And the question of what we do is very important, and I think that's something that I'd like the public to do better, to name the feelings that are present among us and ask why they're significant. Are they telling us that we are afraid of ourselves or afraid of somebody else? Are they telling us that we are worried about not being able to provide for our children in the future? What are the significance of these feelings? And then we can start to ask the question, well, let's look at the external consequences and figure out whether we can regulate transactions in some way. This is so strange. I'm so used to the question, answer. So every time I stop speaking, I'm like listening for the next question. And I realize I have them all down in front of me. Public forums. newspapers are a good space for public discourse, and it would probably depend on people's ability to access and read more than one newspaper. I think letters to the editor are useful. I think writing columns. There was a piece in the New York Times the other day about a woman who's teaching other women to learn how to write columns, editorials in the newspaper in an effort to make their points, make them succinctly and provide evidence and so forth. I think that's still a viable forum. I think the internet has made it possible for people to interact and discuss and debate things in a way that it wasn't before. But I think ultimately, you're right, it's difficult to make public claims and have them be heard, especially when there's so much competing for attention, and especially when we have to deal with government officials who don't necessarily have the public interest in their mind. But I don't know that there's any other choice that we have. So as long as there are forums that we can identify or create, such as what we have here today, or you know, in our neighborhoods and so forth, then I think it's possible to have some sort of public forum. Are we driven more by our feelings than by our intellect? My dad and I have had that conversation. And I would have to say, probably both. Probably both. And it may depend on the circumstance or the issue. If we're not feeling particularly happy, then it's likely that sort of pained disposition might influence what we do. If we're happy, similarly, that might influence what we do. It might make it more likely for us to take reasons seriously, or potentially less likely, depending on how happy we are and what the reasons are. But I think the idea, or one of sort of the useful things that Aristotle teaches us, and I actually think Dewey was quite influenced by Aristotle, even though he doesn't name the man in his book. Aristotle teaches us that it's possible to create deliberate desires. It's possible to think about emotions as pieces of information, and to figure out how to balance emotions, how to find sort of a moderate position that allows one to take reason seriously. So that's something that people who are interested in rhetoric and persuasion have to attend to. But nevertheless, I think ultimately we're driven by both our feelings and our intellect, and it's important to keep that in mind so that we can identify those times when we believe our emotions are taking precedence, and maybe it's time to say, okay, stop, let me think a little bit more. How to get feelings out without having someone attempt to steer them. I don't think it's, I mean, I think as long, one of the things about the public is that it's, I mean, I've sort of presented it as a positive space, but it's also a negative space as well. So there's a risk in speaking. There's a risk in expressing one's feelings. There's a risk in making any claim, any argument, any contribution to public discourse. So I guess with Dewey's idea of critical vigilance, I think that's where I would fashion an answer. You have to keep paying attention, and you have to keep speaking out, and you have to keep asking yourselves, or we have to keep asking ourselves questions. Why are we so happy, or why were enough of us so happy to let Karl Rove and his cronies, and that's my personal view, run the show, right? Why were we that willing? What is it about us that made that possible? So we need to be vigilant about the Karl Roves, and we also need to be vigilant of ourselves. Are communities that are less car-dependent more publicly oriented? I used to live in Chicago, and only for 5 years, and one of the things I miss about Chicago is the public transportation system, and the fact that it's really easy say that I had many conversations with people walking down the street or sitting on the L, and I didn't get the sense that people were sort of open to conversations by virtue of the fact that they were outside in sort of the public space. I would think that because of the sheer proximity, there's a chance that publicity is more likely. But I don't know that I would say simply because they're all sort of on the street that they're more likely to interact. I think it may have something to do with sort of how people think of themselves and the people around them. If they think of the people around them as strangers, then they're not likely to interact with them. If they think of them as, a potential friend or someone from the neighborhood or another human being who might have something interesting to say or who might have been having a crappy day and might appreciate someone saying, hey, how are you doing, then they'll probably be more likely to respond. So it might have more to do with sort of the mindset, the way we think of each other, as opposed to whether we're actually in the same space at the same time outside of a car.